On the 23rd of December 2001, Argentine President Adolfo Rodriguez Sá announced that the country had defaulted on $93 billion worth of debt. Soon after, the country's GDP fell by around 20%, unemployment increased to 25%, and the number of people in poverty rose to 55%. A year later, the economy would shrink by another 11%. What caused this crisis? In order to understand the 2001 crisis, we have to go back to the 1990s. To understand the 90s, we need to go to the 80s. To understand that, a look at Peronism is needed. And to get that, we probably need to read Argentina's history since its founding, maybe even read up on Spanish colonialism.
Excuse me, it's too much.
But since we don't have time, let's just go back to 1989 when the country would elect Carlos Menem. Menem inherited a country in crisis. Inflation was at 3000%, economic growth was low, and the budget deficit was out of control. Menem first tried to cut the budget deficit by raising taxes, privatizing state-owned companies, reducing regulations, and lowering trade barriers to raise exports. This worked somewhat as the country was able to lower inflation and increase economic growth. Soon after, however, inflation would go up again and the government would need a new strategy. That came in 1991 when the finance minister would introduce the convertibility plan, which involved fixing the value of the Argentine peso 1-to-1 with the dollar. This restored people's faith in the peso and inflation was brought down to single digits. That year, the economy would grow at 10.5%. The convertibility plan, along with other reforms, allowed Argentina to rapidly grow its economy from 1991 to 1994. Despite a setback in 1995 due to the Mexican tequila crisis, the economy would recover and expand till 1997. While it looks like Menem has figured out the formula for economic growth, problems were beginning to emerge. The privatization of state-owned companies led to many people being fired, raising unemployment to 10%, which did not go down despite strong economic growth. Another issue was borrowing. In order to enforce convertibility, the government set up a currency board whose purpose was to maintain the peg. This meant that the government had given up its monetary independence, as the peso's value was linked to the dollar. Because of this, the government could not print money to cover its deficits, forcing it to borrow dollars from abroad. Now this was fine as long as there was faith in the government and interest rates were affordable. Another issue was the decision to fix the currency's value to the dollar, even though Argentina's biggest trade partners were Brazil and the EU, who used different currencies. The government was also spending more money to keep the economy growing. This was fine as long as economic growth was high and inflation was manageable. In 1998, external events would cause Argentina to enter a recession. These events were the Russian and Brazilian financial crisis in 1998 and 1999. These, as well as the Asian financial crisis the year before, put pressure on the Argentine peso, which could not depreciate because it was fixed to the dollar, making it overvalued, resulting in Argentina's exports becoming more expensive. These external events also lowered people's confidence in the country, and interest on its debt started to go up, making borrowing more expensive. To compensate, the government started raising taxes and cutting spending, but this had the effect of shrinking the economy and reducing tax collection even more. Another problem was that the dollar's value appreciated to a 15-year high, making Argentina's exports even more expensive. It did not help that Brazil depreciated its own currency, making it cheaper than the Argentine peso. The country was running a budget deficit and a current account deficit. Its debt was also growing and becoming more and more expensive to pay off. Desperate, the country went to the IMF for support, which it received on the condition that it enact economic reforms. But by the end of 2001, people had lost faith and started to withdraw all their money from banks, causing a bank run. The government responded by freezing all deposits and only allowed limited amounts of money to be withdrawn. Things only got worse when the IMF cut off its support on the 5th of December. As Argentina had failed to meet conditions, it agreed to follow in the IMF program. Having no other source of getting dollars and believing enacting reforms would be too costly and painful, it defaulted on its debt, making it the largest sovereign default in history.